You're
One.
very welcome to the Irish Political Roundup with me, Roisin the Cleric.
And me, Paul Brophy.
Paul, tell us who have we got on the show and what are we talking about tonight?
Well, Roisin, we're going back to our political profile series, and tonight we're delighted to be joined by Peadar Tóibín, TD, who is the leader of Aontu. Peadar himself was first elected to the Dáil in 2011 for the Meath West constituency. So from 2000 and prior to 2011, he was a member of Navan Town Council from 2007 to 2011. Prior to entering politics, Peadar worked as a business consultant and he has a degree in politics and economics. In 2018, he resigned from Sinn Fein and formed Aontu, which is Irish for unity. Aontu is a 32 county party and has local councillors in both north and south of the border. Peadar himself is currently the only Aontu TD in the Dáil after successfully holding a seat in 2020, and hopefully after the next election, Aontu's numbers will increase. Peadar, you're very welcome to the Irish Political Roundup.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, Roisin. Greatly appreciated.
Uh, Peadar, I suppose we'll start from the very beginning. You joined Sinn Fein while you were in college in UCD. You're studying politics and economics, but I suppose by picking those two subjects, was politics always something that you were going to go down the line of?
Yeah, I suppose I became politically aware very young, and one of the most important, I suppose, political things that switched me on was, when I was, I think, 7 or 8 years old, the hunger strikes were going on in the north of Ireland. And I was very young at the time, and it just, there were shocking images, obviously, on the television, very powerful images on the television. And it basically gave me an interest to see what was happening just in the north, a few miles up the road. And so I can remember reading books by Tim Coogan on the north of Ireland, at the age of 12 and 13. And, I remember, being very plugged into what was happening to both communities, north and south. And that really plugged me into politics. I suppose in the early days, Sinn Féin's support was very low in the south, especially. It didn't look like a viable political option, really, for many years. And actually, in the very early days, believe it or not, I actually got involved in Fianna Fáil and was actually a press officer in a Fianna Fáil Cumann in UCD in my very early days. But I kind of realised, even at that stage in Fianna Fáil, that there was about 30% of the people I knew there that were good, decent people who were, wanted to work for the betterment of everybody. But there was a large proportion of people I recognised at the time were kind of into it for their own kind of career advancement. Either they wanted to get in the fast track to political success, or they wanted to know people who were involved, who were going to be ministers in future. And for me, I felt that I wanted to be involved in a political movement where the objective was bigger than the individuals. That was cohesive, was focused, and was determined to make change. So I was living in Dublin at the time, and a couple of years later, then I joined the Sinn Fein Cumann in Dublin, and I worked away at that for a couple of years there. And then I came back to Navan, and I got stuck into the local organisation in Navan from about 2000 onwards.
Okay. And would you come from a political family, or was your family kind of either interested or active in politics, or did you kind of go it on your own?
Yeah, no, I definitely did come from a political family, but not in a party political fashion. I'm the youngest of 7 children, and all our dinner table conversations were heavily political at home. So there was, whenever the issue of the day was, whether it was the divorce referendum, the abortion referendum, or whether it was about what was happening in the north of Ireland, or the level of emigration that was happening in the early the 80s and 90s. These were big debates, and because there was so many of us, we often took the opposite positions than our parents, and the reason we did it, I suppose, was to kind of test and challenge them to see how real and valid their positions were. And like in fairness to my parents, they weren't dogmatic about issues. They were very much evidence based, and the conversation was very open and free flowing. My father would have been from a Fianna Fáil family. I think my grandmother on my father's side was involved in Cumann na Mán. My mother was from a Fine Gael family, and there were farmers from West. Well, they were exactly. There were farmers from Westmeath, and there was a kind of natural inclination to that way. But none of them. They weren't invested in those parties. They would vote on who was doing the most work and who was providing the best policies as well. So believe it or not, I think I wore an FG sticker, Fine Gael sticker, into first class when Gareth Fitzgerald won the general election that year. My mother might have stuck it on me, but it didn't stick. It didn't stick anyways.
Absolutely. And you, as you said, you got active in your local Sinn Fein coming in around the year 2000, 23 years ago. And you ran in the 2004 local elections. Unfortunately, you weren't successful. But you were co-opted to Navan Town Council. How did you find that experience, and what did you make of the decision back in 2014 by Phil Hogan to scrap town councils?
Yeah, so I suppose just a bit to your earlier question, I was very determined to get involved in politics, and that's why I took on politics and economics. I did a postgrad afterwards in Michael Smurf's School of Business in terms of enterprise. And the reason I did those subjects is because I just wanted to bring something of value to the political system. And I noticed that, a lot of, economics was missing big style from the political sphere in Ireland. And we had many people who really didn't have a political background. And that was a weakness, I thought, in the direction of this country. I really enjoyed the election in 2004. And even though I lost it, I actually think it's the best thing in my life to lose election. And I would encourage everybody to lose their first election if they can. And the reason being is because you'll never take anything for granted ever again. No. You will make sure that you cover every single base, pull out all the stops, and do everything that's necessary to properly compete. Because I was heartbroken after 2004. I loved being a town councillor, I'll be honest with you. Sometimes being a councillor is actually more rewarding than actually being a TD. Really? And the reason being is because you actually get real issues coming in, and you can work on them and you can fix them, and then you can go on to another real issue and fix them. The town councils were really valuable right across the country. Many small towns and rural regional towns had a little engine of elected representatives, some officials pushing for the improvement and betterment of that town all the time. And when that layer of democracy was cut out, it really had a negative impact, I think, on the development of a lot of towns in the country. Absolutely.
You had, areas, massive areas, like could be, I don't know, take Meath, it could be like, 100 kilometers, and you have all these different areas and all have different needs. And so it's, it's very hard to kind of, balance it out in a county anywhere.
Yeah. No, there's no doubt it was a major mistake, and really it needs to be returned. And Aontú would be very strongly in favour of returning the town council level of democracy. It would make an awful improvement to a significant number of towns. I even just learning politically as well at that level is very, very important too. And learning the importance of when I got elected, I really learned the value of campaigning. I'm a very strong view that there's three ways to change things in the country. There's obviously general elections for sure, that changes things. But campaigning, at the time when I was a councillor, the governments and the HSE were looking to close surgery services in Navan, and this was something that really frustrated me, that a growing town in a big county population-wise was going to lose surgery services. And that town council gave me a platform to kind of to build a campaign along with others to save services. And the thing about it, like I remember the surgery services were going to be closed on a Saturday. On a Monday, I said, listen guys, we have to hold a rally outside of the hospital. People were saying, oh, don't do it, you want to be small numbers. If you have small numbers, it will go against the campaign. And my attitude was, listen, get out there and let's do this. Don't be looking at what might go wrong or what mightn't work. Look at what could happen here. And to be honest, only 150 people turned out on that rainy Saturday. But we decided after that to build and build, and we did. And over the months, we grew to 10,000 people onto the street. And we brought 10,000 people onto the streets on 4 different occasions over the last 10 years. And as a result, we've managed to keep the emergency, the ED open in Navan so far. And, we basically got involved in campaigns to get the rail line back into the county. So all of those things, more Gardaí into the county, the Greenway along the Boyne. The platform of the council gives people a great education into local democracy and gives them a platform to start campaigning for people. And that's an important lesson I learned at council.
Absolutely. Am I correct in saying you never served on Meath County Council?
Never served in Meath County Council. And it's funny because I often get questions about planning. And because I was a town councillor, planning would never have come up on the radar too often in that. So I would never have been greatly experienced in that issue. Yes. So never, unfortunately, on Meath County Council. But we do have Aontú has a councillor in Meath at the moment, which is great. So we have that access to that facility currently.
And in 2011, you got elected to the Dáil as a town councillor, which was, a fantastic achievement, because most people would argue that it's a county councillor that would get elected to the Dáil, but you booked that trend, and you were a very prominent member of the Sinn Fein from French for about the 6-7 years you were there. You would have kind of spoken a lot on economic policy and things like that. Did you feel, as spokesperson, on enterprise, did you have much say into the formulation of those policies, or was there kind of people kind of pulling the strings?
Well, I'll be honest, in terms of economic policy and in terms of, I suppose, enterprise was my key spokesperson's position during that period of time. I was given great space. I was never really hemmed in terms of enterprise policy. Obviously, there'd be advice given, and there'd be, of course, you'd listen to the room as well, and you try to understand where people are at. But no, there's definitely great leeway given in that space, and the 2011 election was an earthquake election in many ways. It was, it happened just after the economic crash. Fianna Fáil basically, I basically believe that about 1 million votes became mobile after that crash, and we're looking for a new home other than Fianna Fáil. And even Fine Gael as such. And most of those votes went towards Labour, first of all, with the Gilmore Gael. But they then, when Gilmore hadn't fulfilled his promise to the people after that, they looked for a new home. And I was given great space in terms of the enterprise portfolio. One of my difficulties was, during that period of time, I suppose Sinn Féin were changing, especially on social issues. So, the party of Martin McGuinness, who would have had same views as myself on a lot of different social issues, we were that kind of what I would say common sense attitude was starting to recede, and the ideologues, the people who were more orientated towards, I suppose, fairly left social policy, they were getting the upper hand. And the difficulty I had as well is that I suppose that, the Ardèche was meant to be the place in which decisions were made, but in reality, decisions were made well in advance of an Ardèche as well. So I was a member of the,
just rubber stamping.
To a certain extent, I was a member of the Ard Comhairle of that party for a number of years, and I was asked to join the National Officer Board, which was a group of the 10 people who run the party. I didn't join it because I would have had to delete my right to speak on things like the right to life if I joined that, and I wasn't willing to compromise, in that relation. So, there were many good people in that organization. There's still many decent people in that organization for sure. But I do think that Sinn Féin have moved fairly radically to what I would say probably the woke agenda to a certain extent.
Something we'll want to get into in a little bit. And in 2018, you advocated yourself for a no vote, and you were suspended by Sinn Fein, and then you took the decision to leave Sinn Fein. You were independent for a little bit, and then 2019 you set out the big task of establishing a new party. The last kind of new party that we can think of that had a kind of a fairly big impact, for better or for worse, was the Progressive Democrats in the late 80s. But with the changes in standards of public office and everything, but setting up a new party is extremely difficult.
Yeah, so the last couple of years I was in Sinn Fein, I became completely aware that the party had moved in a fairly significant aspect. I was also being benched at that stage. So in other words, I wasn't being given opportunities to debate on television or radio, etc. in the main. So I realized that separate ways were going to have to come. And so yeah, in January 2019, we founded a new political movement across Ireland. And absolutely, Paul and Roisin, it's probably one of the most difficult jobs that you could ever imagine. And I listened to TDs, in here and in the Dáil, and they talk about how they're going to set up a new party and this and that. And the level of commitment, the level of time, the patience, the effort is absolutely incredibly big to set up an organization. And we set it up, and you mentioned simple rules. When you have no money at all, what you're operating on is volunteerism. And when you're in a new organization, you have to some people come to you. You have to try to work out the quality of the individuals, and you have to bring good people into positions of authority and development and influence, and little by little we did that. We actually, what I did at the time, I think it was in 2019, I did literally, I think it was 36 public meetings across the 32 counties.
Yeah, we actually met you in Kilkenny when you came.
Yeah.
That's right. And I think I forget what the numbers were, but there were basically about 6,000 people attended Aontú meetings that year. And it literally was like we would put up a few posters, a bit of social media, an article in a newspaper, and 200 or 300 people would show up at a meeting, and we would just set out our objective, and we would have people sign up as members. Yeah. And then one thing I suppose I learned from my last political party is that we want to build a grassroots organization. So one of the problems with Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Labour, and the other parties is, in many ways, they have lost their common structure. They've lost their grassroots structure. So I would talk to Fianna Fáilers and Fine Gaelers who would say in some counties there's no common denominator. and I think that's a weakness, first of all, because if you don't have your grassroots feeding information up to you, how do you know what's really going on in people's lives other than focus groups and polls? And then the second thing is the ground war in politics is still incredibly important. So there's two wars. There's the ground war, where you have people who will campaign and canvass and leaflet and poster and all that kind of work. And then there's the air war, which is television and media and radio and interviews like this to a certain extent, and social media. But I think the large establishment parties have forgotten about that ground war, and we're very, very focused on building that strong organization. So we set up commons in each county in the country. They meet on a monthly basis. They focus on the bread and butter issues that are affecting the local communities, and they campaign on those issues. And then when you see that work go on, you see kind of good people filter up, and you see, well, that person's a good person for a candidate. And we selected about 50 or 60 candidates across the country at the moment.
Okay.
For the local elections, and those people are building their own names. They're building the names of the party, and they're getting stuck into bread and butter issues affecting people as well.
And I suppose it's important that you're a 32 county party. How important was that? Because we've seen likes of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael kind of make kind of small little overtures that we may consider organising in the north, but they never really done anything. I know that the Fianna Fáil kind of alliance with the SDLP didn't exactly go down too well. But I suppose that's being a 32 county party is extremely important.
But first of all, I love Ireland, and that's one of the reasons why I'm involved in politics. I really want to see this country prosper and do well. But Ireland is 32 counties, and also, if you want to represent Irish people, you have to stand in Derry, you have to stand in West Belfast and North Belfast and South Belfast and East. If you want to represent Irish people, you have to put your name on the ballot paper where Irish people live in Ireland. And the idea that we would become a regional party like Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael or the Labour Party just did not wash with me. I wouldn't be involved in politics, to be honest, in the first place, other than the United Ireland objective. That was the objective that drove me to get involved in politics. And I do believe Ireland would be a far stronger place. We'd have a bigger market. We would have more influence in the European Union. We would have, far greater efficiencies in terms of the health service, education services. All the different departments are duplicated at the moment, which is a severe waste of money and time and effort. It would be a better, more efficient country if we were united. And to be honest, I remember the membership card that I got the day I joined Fianna Fáil, and Irish Unity was at the top of that membership card. And it just really frustrates me that that Fianna Fáil have lost all ambition and interest really in a United Ireland, as far as I can see. Now, don't get me wrong, there are decent Fianna Fáilers there who would still, feel a strong desire to see independence and unity. But there is no evidence amongst the leadership of that organisation that they want to pursue that. Fine Gael actually sound a little bit more United Irelandish at the moment than Fianna Fáil, and that's saying a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose we can't talk about the North without it's the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, but as you alluded to in the Dáil, you have Stormont not up and running. You have the North-South Ministerial Council not up and running. You have a Tory government, which, let's say they're the better. How do you see things unfolding in the time ahead?
Yeah, I think things are very dark at the moment, unfortunately. As you say, no executive, no assembly, no North-South Ministerial Council. You have a legacy bill going through Westminster, which basically gives amnesty for people who carried out murders in the north of Ireland. It stops victims and survivors pursuing justice and truth in their cases of their own experiences.
And of course, you used parliamentary privilege to name Soldier 8. And
we basically said if the British pass this legislation, we will name the rest of the soldiers who were involved in the massacre on Bloody Sunday in Derry as well. And don't get me wrong, I don't take that lightly in any ways. I would never, ever consider naming anybody who hadn't been proven guilty in a court of justice. But if the British are going to get rid of the ability to find somebody guilty in a court of justice, so what option do we have? And why should the names of the people murdered on Bloody Sunday be known to everybody, but the murderers be anonymous?
Absolutely.
My grandmother was on that march.
What's that?
My grandmother was on the march on Bloody Sunday.
And it's a great legacy for your family to have people who fought for what were civil rights, and that's what it was. It was a civil rights march. It was no more and no less, and we have that replicated in many parts of the north. And many people in the south would know of Bloody Sunday. People might know of Ballymurphy. They might know of the O'Dowd family, the Reevy family, the Mullins. The Glenanne murders. Spring Hill. All of these. Situations, and it often frustrates me that the Southern government has never really been that interested in finding justice. Like if the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, you would imagine that any sovereign government would be determined to find out what the truth is, but there's never been an effort. And Aontú brought forward a bill which has just passed first stage in the Dáil, which will set up a commission of investigation in the south into all killings carried out in relation to British collusion. It would be able to have the power to force people and papers to give evidence in the south, but could collect evidence from the north of Ireland and Britain, and also it would be able to look at evidence produced by other state investigations. So the police ombudsman's office in the north of Ireland has carried out really good investigations into collusion recently, and we would be able to include that into the suppose, filling the jigsaw pieces around what happened in the north. But it takes a small party like Aontu to do that. And I tried to get Sinn Fein to support it. And I spoke to Sinn Fein TD, and it's interesting what she said. She says, sometimes I wonder why we never think of these things. And large parties often get very settled with the status quo, of course.
Yeah.
Do you think the southern TDs or the southern political parties understand the dynamics and the people of the 6 counties in the north?
Not properly. And the only way you can is to stand candidates. The only way you can really understand what's happening in the north is to have membership in the north. Because otherwise you're detached and you're looking in from your own perspective. So only parties with candidates and reps and members who are fighting on those issues in the 6 counties will ever properly represent those issues in the Dáil properly, if you know what I mean. And listen, I hope to see this someday, and I would welcome and I would urge Fianna Fáil to go in to the north, and the same with Fine Gael. Oftentimes the reason that they don't is because, and this is a big thing in politics, people often don't do things because they think they're going to lose or they'll fail. And I would say to anybody, and I would know people out there who'd love to be a candidate or love to get involved in politics, and they go, oh, sure, what if I failed? And I tell you what, you'll never do anything in your life if you're going to be a prisoner of failure. And, the 2004 election, I failed in my chances of getting there. But all you do is you learn how to do it better the next time. And, if Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael or Labour are worried about going in and not winning seats, keep at it. It might take 5 years, it might take 10 years. Build and grow, and you have some opportunity then of being able to be an all-Ireland national party.
But it didn't work out between Fianna Fáil, though, when it was the downfall when I was up there in Derry for the John Hume funeral from grassroots SDLP people, that they went into bed with Fianna Fáil, because you still have the memory and the generations of De Valera selling the North out, even though it was, he sent over Michael Collins. It's still embedded, because my grandmother, you weren't allowed to say De Valera, and I never knew for years why until I grew up. So there's still that issue up north with Fianna Fáil and De Valera and selling the 6 counties out.
No, there's definitely historical legacies there within Fianna Fáil, etc. The problem is, I think SDLP are in trouble in the north at the moment, and they're suffering the same experience as some of the southern parties. They've lost their grassroots.
Yes.
Aontu, I understand Aontu have more members in the north of Ireland now than the SDLP do. And there was a poll there recently, a Lucid Talk poll, which broke up the north into different regions. And in the Foyle, East Derry, North Antrim region, it put Aontu at 4%, and it put the SDLP at 6%. Even though the SDLP would have MPs, MLAs, and councillors to beat the band in that area. But many of those, the former support. See, the problem with the SDLP too is that the leadership have become completely detached from the membership. They're literally like 2 parties facing different directions now at the moment.
They never recovered from John Hume. John Hume made the party. He was the party. I know a lot of people won't accept that. I suppose I'm a Glen girl, the way John Hume was a Glen boy. And, he knew everyone, and he would walk across the street to say hello to you if he knew, he'd never walked past you. Hume taught me in school. I was one of her last students.
Very good.
Before she gave up work to go and work for John. So they haven't really, SDLP never recovered from John Hume stepping down as leader.
See, I think John Hume had a vision. He had a very passionate desire to achieve that vision. And that was missing from then on. And I think if a political party doesn't have a very strong vision for an objective that's bigger than themselves, well, you're simply not going to get investment from people in terms of time and effort. Because if a political party just says, vote for us, we'll manage things a little bit differently and maybe a bit better than the rest. Sure, why would a young person leave, join an OGRA organization in college, university? People want to work for objectives and plans and projects that are more important than themselves. And the SDLP doesn't offer that vision at the moment. And it doesn't really understand, I think, what it offers, really, currently.
And on United Ireland, if we had when do you think we will see a referendum on a United Ireland? And if there was one, say tomorrow, how do you think it would do?
Yeah, now I suppose Aontú are a little bit more, we're different than the other political parties in that we believe in a stagist approach, an incrementalist approach. And for example, we would have already brought legislation into the South, well, past the first stage at least, looking for the rights for Northern MPs to be able to speak in the Dáil, the rights to Northern MPs to be able to participate in committees in the Dáil. Nothing stopping it constitutionally. All it would take is a vote of the Dáil and a change of the standing orders to provide for it. And that successfully passed first stage. And our attitude is like this: like, we see the border nearly as a wall with 1,000 blocks. And our attitude is, right now we should be taking down some of those blocks. So some of those blocks are, the lack of a cross-border cancer service, or the lack of a Gael school curriculum service, north and south. So we can start unifying different aspects of Irish society. You could have, for example, in the same ways now that we have an All-Ireland energy market, you could look to develop a fully All-Ireland tourism market, or to design excise duties the same on both sides of the border to stop big swings in the price of fuel and diesel, which close petrol stations down on one side of the border for one period of time, and then close them down the other side of the border for the other period of time. We could start, instead of actually for two jurisdictions spatially developing with their backs to each other, we should say, okay, let's spatially develop as one island. Like, the mad thing about it is, when they designed the motorway from Belfast to Newry, instead of the logical thing of going straight to Dundalk, they decided to go to Warren Point, a lovely, beautiful fishing village in the foothills of the Mournes. Do you know what I mean? So, when universities are being invested in, we're not doing it together. And if we started to plan, invest, and deliver services together on each one of these different areas, first of all, they will be better services, they'll be more efficient, and they'll be cheaper. And most of that actually doesn't threaten necessarily the political sensibilities of unionism, but it would say that by the time that when unity does happen, it'd be a much easier transition to happen, because most of that transition would have happened in the meantime.
Because when you talk about United Ireland, there are so many questions, and the level, I don't even know the level of planning being done, Peadar, as regards how would the police services in Northern Ireland and Garda Síochána, the health service, various different other education, how is it all going to kind of work? And that there are other parties that are saying, yes, referendum, now is the time. Okay, but if you don't have as you said, the nuts and the bolts in place, it's going to be very hard to get the
we do believe in a referendum, and we do believe we have to change. We want to bring as many unionists on board as possible, but there's nothing stopping the hard work starting now. And I believe in hot pursuit, for example, with regards the Gardaí. The Gardaí shouldn't have to. The border shouldn't be a competitive advantage to a criminal. The Garda shouldn't have to pursue a criminal and then stop at the border. You know what I mean? It should be able to drive straight through the border and pursue. Now, obviously, people would have maybe a problem with the PSNI pursuing south of the border, because obviously MI5 still has a role in the direction of the PSNI. But we do need to start sector by sector, looking at how we can start working closer together. And there shouldn't be a service developed ever again on the islands that's developed on a partitionist basis. We should be moving forward together, and that's where we are on that. And unfortunately, I actually, one of the problems I've always had with Sinn Fein is that lack of practical approach to that development. I've always urged them to get more practical in terms of working out, all of this. Each of the county councils should have a memorandum of understanding with the corresponding county council on the other side of the border about services that they could be sharing and using, investments that they could be making together, all of that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. It's, for want of a word, some other parties, they see this United Ireland or referendum on as a blunt instrument, where Whereas you have to kind of, it's very new. It's a nuanced thing.
There's a couple of points that make the other big project that we have in Aontú is the devolution of powers from London to Belfast. So in Scotland, 22% of the spending the Scottish Parliament has is locally raised because it has far more taxation powers. Even in Wales, they get 10% of all their investment is locally raised. In the north, it's only 5%, and that's all they have is rates. They can only put rates up if they want to, create money for investment. They have the power to do corporation taxes, but they've never actually agreed to be able to change corporation taxes. Now that they've access to the British economy and the European economy, imagine if they equalize the corporation tax with the south of Ireland.
Yeah,
and they would have a labour cost competitive advantage on the south in terms of bringing in foreign direct investment. And we're about, the politics of ambition and prosperity. Most of the politics, even around Sinn Fein, is still a politics of dependency on the block grant from London. And we shouldn't be arguing about, for me, the block grant is kind of like a landlord throwing the money up in the air and the local peasants scurrying around the ground picking up the landlord's money. Let's start making our own money. Good, well-paid jobs for our young people. Develop the taxation to be able to invest it into the public services that we need.
And in 2020, you got re-elected to Meath West. You were the only Aontú candidate elected. I think you got about 1.9% of the national vote.
That's right.
You were just off the cut, just short of getting that magic 2%, which allows you to access state funding. The world has changed massively in that short space of time. We've had COVID-19 and the whole pandemic response and vaccinations, etc. I know the government are looking at a kind of a review of how the whole COVID situation was handled. Did we, looking back, are there things that should have been done differently?
Yeah, so I suppose we got the 2020 election was literally about a year since we were formed, so we were literally putting things into place. And also remember at the time we were finding it very difficult to get any media attention whatsoever, and I'll be honest with you, really finding it very difficult. And we did miss out on the 2,000 more votes would have probably brought us €250,000 extra funding a year, and that would have meant we'd be able to employ 4, 5, 6 people. Who will be able to work full time on building this political organization, this movement. However, we are very thankful that we have many very decent volunteers around the country. We're the only political party in the Dáil that's not funded. But if you look at the work rate that we're involved in, the stories that we're breaking, and the positions that we're taking, we're significantly different. And you mentioned a very good point there around COVID. So one of our major platforms is, first of all, Aontú has to be common sense. So we have to take the common sense position. The second issue for us is, debate, respectful debate is the engine of a functioning democracy. Okay. Yeah. Now, if you censor debate, or if you hamper debate, or if you make people feel that they can't speak up, well, then you're simply not going to get a good result democratically from that. You're simply going to hide. You're not going to have that competition of ideas that's so necessary for democracy to function. And what happened during COVID was very quickly, the political establishment stated that if you disagreed with the COVID approach, you were in some way not following the science, and actually you could have been, you weren't using your head, or you weren't logical, or you were on the edges of the political spectrum. Now, we definitely took the issue seriously. It was a real illness. Many people suffered very significantly. But our belief was we needed to protect the people in the nursing homes the most. We needed to protect older people the most. And we couldn't understand why the government wasn't doing that. Indeed, the government moved thousands of people out of hospitals into nursing homes without testing them for COVID. The government actually seeded COVID in nursing homes across the country. And then they refused to give the nursing homes the necessary staff. Like, we had nursing homes that were calling out to us that couldn't get staff. They were going on Facebook looking for staff. They were ringing the relatives of the residents looking for help. And the government, they couldn't get staff. In one case in Galway, 2 staff held a nursing home where 5 people died over a weekend together, and they were working for 48 hours non-stop, trying to hold it together. And at the same time, the minister wouldn't meet with Tig Daly, who was head of Nursing Homes Ireland. We had Paul Reid, who wasn't responding to ministers for months, and then saying everything was fine. We had Simon Harris, who did this big kind of Be On Call for Ireland thing, where 70,000 people signed up to help. People came home from Australia to help, and about 300 people out of that 70,000 people were ever employed. Like, it was just astounding. And then we had, this, for us, really poor decisions around COVID passes. And, for sure, like, we left the decision for people around COVID vaccines to themselves. We said, people should inform themselves the best way they can. They should look at their own, let's say, exposure to the illness, etc., and they should act accordingly. But the state came in and said, well, if you don't take the COVID vaccines, you can't actually function as a citizen in this country. And the difficulty of that was, it didn't make sense, because you could still get COVID even if you're vaccinated, and you could still pass on COVID if you're vaccinated. So there was no logic to it. And Aontú was the only political party, again, pushing back against that. The government closed down the house building for a full quarter during the COVID crisis. No other European country closed down house building at all.
And we're paying the price for that.
Except us. And we had the worst housing crisis in the whole country. We closed down schools for longer than any other country, which had a massive effect on children's development and their mental health. We closed down cancer services, mental health services. We closed down stroke services and, cardiac services, even though today 450 people will get cancer, and today 29 people will die of cancer. I was talking to consultants who were telling me that their waiting lists have gone from 2 years to 6 years to see a person with cancer. I had skin in the game, unfortunately, at the time, that I got skin cancer just at the start of COVID. And thankfully, I wasn't delayed in my diagnosis or treatment, but I delayed my own treatment, in that I felt at the start, God, I can't be going to the doctor with this small little thing, because the doctors are overwhelmed with this COVID thing. It just wouldn't make sense for me to go in. So I waited about 4 months, probably longer than I should have, before I did something around it. But thankfully, I did get my treatment, and I'm cancer free at this moment in time, thank God. But so many other people currently have far more advanced cancers than they would have had if the government didn't do what they did. And that really frustrates me. So we brought about another bill into looking for the government to carry out a commission of investigation into all these decisions. And the government want to push back as much as they can. They really do not want to lift the lid over what happened in the last 2.5 years.
With the COVID, and as you said, it was censorship. And at the bottom line, it was censorship within politics, it was censorship within the media, and censorship really in the sense of within the local communities. Because if anybody spoke out, they were anti-vax, they were anti-mask, and they were really segregated between even family and friends. So, and that came down from the government and the media down, their masks, and anyone who wasn't vaccinated, that they were actually ostracized from society. Do you think that even now that there's still censorship within our country, and we're still divided?
Well, there's no doubt. I think, and I often think that Ireland in the 1950s was a very uniform space that didn't allow for diversity of views that often. And Ireland in 2023 is exactly the same, except it's not the same religion or ideology or our views or values, but it's equally rigid in terms of its uniformity and opposition to diversity of views. And in this country, we have the state wears the colors of diversity, and yet it doesn't allow for diverse views or diverse value systems. It really interested me in the local elections, and I think it was 2019, We had a former Labour councillor who stood for us in Galway, and she was invited by Ógra Sinn Fein to speak at a Women in Politics meeting. Now, when Ógra Sinn Fein found out that she supported the human rights to life, they disinvited her from that meeting. And they also suspended the Ógra Sinn Fein member who had the temerity to invite her to that public meeting. And it seems to me that the message was, we support completely the diversity of views that exists in this country as long as it agrees with us. And that's really at the heart. And that's a big danger. And one of the weaknesses we have, we don't have a diverse media in the society. Like, there's 1,000 national journalists in Ireland, tops. Many of them will have to work for different media organizations to pay their mortgages at some stage. Many of them are brilliant journalists and do their damnedest in the work that they do. But we just don't have, in other countries, they have a left-wing media, they have a right-wing media, they have a centrist media, they have a liberal media, conservative media. And all of those media give oxygen to political representatives to be able to articulate their views. And then you have the competition of ideas that allows for people to ascertain what's the best decision. I'll give you just a brief example. I was in Virgin Media Studios a number of years ago with a Fine Gael minister. And at the same time, there was a protest by Labour youth outside of RTE, protesting that Graham Linehan was speaking on a primetime show about transgender issues. And Graham obviously takes a view that, that women should have safe spaces, that there should be women-only sports, etc. But Labour activists were campaigning against his right to even articulate that view. So I spoke to the Fine Gael TD, and it's like, surely we should be allowed to have a free and open and honest and respectful discussion about this really important issue. It has radical effects over society. And, I mentioned obviously that I would have been of view that we should have safe spaces for women, that we should have a situation where women can play women-only sports and so on. And he said, yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I said, well, why don't you say that loud? And he said, I'm sure the media have to take the head off you if you said it out loud. And, that's unfortunately ingrained in all of the political parties. Like, when a political party decides to go out on the plinth or to go in front of journalists, it works to say, well, what kind of questions are they going to ask? And how do we orientate our answers to the questions that are likely to come up? And human nature as well, in answering any question, especially when you're a politician, is to meet somebody at least halfway. So even if you disagree with them, that you'll try to, go a little bit of direction in their views. And if we had a proper balanced media, we would far more likely to have, a proper debate around these issues. Compassion can exist with common sense. Yes. And we do have to have compassion in all of these difficult questions. But we still have to have an ability for common sense as well.
Just while we're on the transgender, now I'm all for, live and let live. I'm all for, everyone being able to have their own sexuality as long as it's with consent and with adults. So what is Aontú's opinion on the Department of Education's use and with transgender education?
Yeah, so I would agree with you, Roisin. Like, I think that, for me personally, just out of kind of respect and, kind of manners, I would normally kind of, identify a person in the manner that they would ask me to identify, just to be helpful, more than anything else. But I do believe that many people do go through gender dysphoria, and we need to have a supportive, compassionate response to that. But the problem is that this government's policy is a radical outlier in the wrong direction. So, for example, the government are looking to teach children as young as 8 and 9 at the moment about what it means to be transgender. Now, first of all, the vast majority of parents are completely opposed to that. But they're not giving parents to say, they're just ramming it through the department. I would have spoken to teachers who have told me that they've been told that in service days not to use the words mother and father anymore in their class because they're not inclusive, not to use the words boys and girls in their class because they're not inclusive. We see the HSC now talking about people with cervixes when they're talking about cervical cancer, which is extremely dangerous because cervical cancer is a killer. And if you're going to produce a leaflet or a message, you need to be very clear in who's affected by it. They talk about chest feeding as well instead of breastfeeding. The government tried to delete the word mother from the maternity legislation that went through just a little while ago. And, so there's a radical change. And this is a concerted effort. This is political. This is the government, doing this in a very concerted, planned manner. And there's very few people standing up against it at all. And the other danger is the government are basing their policy on what's called gender affirmation. And gender affirmation is a policy that basically says that if a young person or a person comes and said, I think I'm the opposite gender, what you do is that, okay, we will bring you along that journey. Now, there may be lots of reasons why a person does have gender dysphoria. It can be a phase for many people for a start, and then they grow out of it. But there could be other comorbidities, which make people feel like they're in the wrong body or they're the other gender. Now, if you don't diagnose those comorbidities and treat them, they never go away, even if you bring the person along that journey, and they still cause equal damage all along that journey. And the danger is then if a child goes down the route of chemical puberty blockers or a surgery, these are irreversible and they can do phenomenal damage. And we have this growing situation now where we have more and more people detransitioning, realizing that due diligence wasn't carried out by the medical professionals in terms of their own experiences. Like we had, people, medical professionals from the gender identity clinic in Ireland, people, the most, we talk about follow the science, the most educated, the most, compassionate people about these areas. And these people have come out and said that the government is being led on ideological grounds, not on evidence-based grounds, and not on scientific-based grounds at all. People need the ability to respectfully and openly discuss this issue. When you delete that, it allows for significant swings in policy, which are often in the wrong direction.
One last thing about that, and I'll hand back over to Paul. There seems to be within the media and everything else, the definition of woman. Do you think the definition of a woman is being diluted and really women are being airbrushed out of our own gender the way we were out of the photographs of the Civil War and in 1921?
Yeah, a woman is an adult female. And the fact is, right now, if you were to ask that question of most TDs would not be able to give you a definition now at the moment. And that's a really, really scary space. And why that's important is women do have, first of all, particular experiences within society. So women are far more likely to be sexually assaulted. They're far more likely to be sexually abused or to suffer from domestic violence or to suffer from workplace difficulties in terms of discrimination than men. They are, in a whole range of different areas, women have a very separate and different experience. Yeah. And if you delete the word woman, well, then you make it far harder to actually deal with those issues and make sure those issues are addressed properly. The idea that being a woman is simply a change of clothes is extremely disrespectful to women, for a start. Extremely disrespectful. Like calling a woman a cis woman is very, very disrespectful, I believe. And then we have this really strange situation, which relates to this, is where we have a sexual offender, male-born sexual offender, who is currently in a prison in Limerick. And I've raised these issues since 2019, and the government are refusing to do anything about it. Varadkar was challenged on it just in the last couple of days. And in fairness, he answered correctly. But I noticed that Simon Harris was speaking the next day and rode back on what the Taoiseach said. So the danger is that ideology is trumping evidence, is trumping science, and it's trumping common sense. And Aontú is a party of common sense. And we're looking to see, can we re-inject that back into the conversation in a respectful fashion, in a fashion that still allows for everybody to be who they are to their full extent without fear or favor from the state. But remember this, in a liberal democracy, the limits to my rights and the limits to your rights are where they negatively infringe somebody else's rights. That's the demarcation line. And right now, the government have cannot see that demarcation line at all.
Well, you've always been an advocate for women, because Karina Malloy mentioned you in her book, that the support that you gave the women of honour and all the sexism within the Defence Forces. And so she really gave you a good, acknowledge that your work and your efforts as you as a person, personally and as a politician, in helping the women of honour.
Well, the women of honour have, first of all, been enormously brave and have spoken about their own horrendous experiences in a public fashion, which I can't imagine how hard it must be. And second of all, they've done a massive service to this country in terms of defence forces. But one of their experience is replicated continuously across the political system. So here are women who were, raped, sexually abused, and basically discriminated against if they tried to push back and fight for their rights. They tell their story, they go to the government says all the right things, but unfortunately it turns out to be platitudes, and say to the women of honour that we will create a commission of investigation and you will determine the terms of reference to that. And then months passed, conversation stops, the women of honour don't have influence over the terms of reference, and the government just proceeds in the way it wants to proceed. And it reminds me of the cervical check scandal, like a situation where women absolutely wronged by the state, the Taoiseach going and apologising and promising that no woman would ever have to go to court again. And yet today, the government is fighting women right up until, in some cases, the week of their death in the courts. And, there is so many examples of the state protecting itself against citizens, and especially women. So there's a lot of work to do to change that culture. We need a culture where the Taoiseach becomes an advocate of the citizen rather than a protector of the system that is fighting against the individual who's been wronged.
And the mother and baby homes, but that's a whole nother story and a whole nother, you've been very vocal on that. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that, because I think it's going to be very important coming up to the next election, because I think the woke agenda, which, if you said that the Aontú are not involved in, the woke agenda has gone just a little bit too far in many senses. Maybe they've forgotten that women vote.
Well, it's funny. I was saying the same thing the other day, Roisin. I think that's I think the hard left have actually overstepped the mark significantly on a range of different social issues, so much so that they have lost, all credibility, and people are actually pushing back now against that. And I think that Aontú is probably the only political vehicle that exists to be able to help people in that journey. And the one thing I would say to people is that Homer Simpson, when he ran for mayor in one of the episodes in The Simpsons, he had a slogan: "Why can't somebody else do it?" And if people have the attitude, "Why can't somebody else do it?" nothing will ever change in this country. If people feel strongly, like I do, about common sense being at the heart of the political system, people have to take responsibility for that, because these issues are not just my responsibility or your responsibility. Every single citizen has an equal responsibility in a democracy to make sure that we live in a decent society. And I would urge people, if they believe in our political project, to go to our website, click on the membership button and get involved. And membership operates on a spectrum to a certain extent, and some people are passive, and that's fine. And other people get involved and they become active, and they work in their local community as well. And all members are welcome. But there's no doubt change will not happen by people staying at home and tipping away at Facebook.
And not be afraid to be labelled far right if they're asking just common sense questions.
Well, first of all, one of the things that I've learned is, if you do the research, if you listen to both sides, and if you're respectful, have the courage of your convictions. And if you get it wrong now and again, that's not the end of the world. Yeah. But if you're paralyzed by the fear of somebody calling you names, or by getting it wrong now and again, well, then you'll never be able to do anything in this area. And respect and common sense and compassion. If we have those three things, nobody can throw anything at us, because we know that those three things stand up in any political debate.
Absolutely. And as Roisin mentioned there, Peadar, There will be a general election at some point in the future. At the moment, you're the only Aontú TD. Have you looked to say, after an election, a government has to be formed? Obviously, you'll be hoping there's more than you'll have plenty more colleagues joining you in the Dáil. Have you thought about maybe supporting a government, or if you were to support a government, what kind of policies or direction would you like to see that government take in order for you to join or support that government?
Well, first of all, I would say this: there will be more than one Aontú TD in the next government, or in the next Dáil. I have no doubt about that. There's about 5 or 6 constituencies where we're performing really well, where our support has radically increased. And if you look at the polls, like some of the polls are putting us about 4%, which is higher than the Labour Party in those polls, is equal to the likes of the Greens, higher than people like the people before profit. And people won't realise this. In the last 3 elections, Aontú has outpolled people for profit, even though they get about 20 times the level of publicity from the establishment media than we did. We actually get more votes than that political party even now. So we will definitely have a team of Aontú TDs in the Dáil for sure. What I would say is this: is that, probably the one I can't see ourselves ever going into government with Fine Gael. I think Fine Gael have created so much damage currently in the state. We will talk to the other political parties. I think it's going to be impossible for us to go into government with the hard left, to be honest. But we will talk to other political parties. But we will not, for us, it's not about a ministerial seat underneath us. It's about, can we actually deliver real change and direction in so many aspects of this country? And unless we can be guaranteed that, we will have no interest in going into government. There's a very big possibility, I think, that Fianna Fáil and Sinn Fein will go into the next government. We'll have a team of maybe 3, 4, 5 Aontú TDs in the opposition benches. We'll have maybe up to 20 councillors across the country, 2,000 members working hard in each area. In that scenario, we will hold those 2 political parties to account. Sinn Fein have been a bit like the Late Show, that they promised everything to everybody at the moment, and that will be hard to fulfil. But we will make sure that they're held to account.
Wow. And what would be the ultimate goal for Aontú? You said you have 5, 6 TDs possibly at the next election. I presume is to grow it and grow it and grow it, and I suppose it's very hard to predict 5, 6, 7 years, 7 years down the line.
This is a very much a long-term project. This is a project that we are significantly invested in, and if anybody thinks that change is going to happen fast, they're wrong, and that's the truth about it. And even if you look at Sinn Féin's growth, when I joined Sinn Féin in '88, they were 2% in the polls, and by '98, they weren't much further on, etc. When I joined Sinn Féin, they had 1 TD and a handful of councillors in the south, and we see ourselves as that long-term development, building the local organisation, getting stuck into local issues, and having the backbone to be able to represent common sense and real people on radio and on television and in the Dáil. And I have no doubt with that political project and our objectives, we will grow. And the issue is events and circumstances often turbo boost the growth of a political party. We can't control those events and circumstances, but what we can control is to make sure that we have the organisation that has the ability to harvest an opportunity that comes our way.
Absolutely. And bring politics back to local grassroots, representing the people and taking local politics to national level.
Yeah, so, while we've discussed many of the big issues, the big ideological issues in the country today, they're extremely important. But many people actually vote with their wallet, whether they're rich or poor or in the middle. They vote on whether they can get access to a house, whether they can access to healthcare when they need it, whether they can get to and from work, that they'll be safe from violence on their streets, and that they'll have a decent education system to use. And, that's why I studied economics. way back when, because if you can provide people with a decent standard of living, decent healthcare, decent housing, people will then trust you with the bigger questions as well. And so our objective is to get those issues right, both in the towns and the villages and the countryside, and to be able to do it in the Dáil. And one of our big projects as well, and it's interesting what happened in the Netherlands last week, whereby you had the Farmers' Party, make massive gains there. And the reason they made massive gains is because they're really pushing back at the political establishment in the Netherlands. But in Ireland, we have pretty much the same situation. We have regional and rural Ireland, which is basically being frozen out of a very Dublin-orientated political system. Like Dublin's overheating at the moment. We have a sprawling commuter belt from Ulster, Connacht and Munster now into Dublin, where young families are spending 2 and 3 hours a day in commuter hell. Yeah. And then we have rural areas and regional areas that are depopulating from their young people. The average age of Balbriggan is 10 years younger than the average age in Killarney. Because if you're a university graduate and you want a job, you probably have to go to Dublin, but you can't afford to live in Dublin, so you have to live 50 miles away and buy or rent a house there. So that spatial mess that's been created is happening because the government all the parties now are so Dublin based. You have 10 counties across the country with no minister, and you have Dublin rests down one constituency in one county where all 4 TDs are ministers. Like, it's phenomenal. 40% of all ministers live in County Dublin, even though it would have a population of 23% of the state. So for us, we want to readdress the imbalance that's happening in this country. And in many ways, we want to challenge the kind of Dublin-based political establishment that's doing this damage.
There's one question what we haven't done. We talk about a lot of ideologies, and we all, the big issue is about immigration and our housing. Now, nobody says, nobody refuses anybody to come to the country when they're fleeing war. But have we overstretched our island's ability when we are struggling in every area to even support Irish, welcoming and bringing people in who need that safety net of fleeing war? But have we sort of got that wrong as well? Too much.
Well, again, the censorship issue that you mentioned earlier is all over this as well, unfortunately. So Aontú's policy is where a person is fleeing war, fleeing violence, or hunger and famine. We believe that we should try our best to provide shelter for that person. We believe that we want to be the good Samaritan to people who really need it. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is we do need a system then to be able to differentiate between who needs it and who doesn't need it. And I put in a parliamentary question recently, and I found out that in the last 5 years, out of 4,600 people who were given deportation orders, only about 300 of those were actually deported by the Gardaí. And the rest is believed that about 700 people left by themselves, but the rest, the government doesn't know where they are. And when asked about where they are, the government has just said that the whereabouts is unknown. So we have this really strange thing that we have a system that's meant to differentiate between someone fleeing violence and war and famine and an economic migrant. Does all this work over years, and then at the end of it, treats both groups the same anyways. And it's like there's a voluntary system there, and that does not make sense. If a deportation order is an order to leave the country, and the government has no interest in implementing that. Now, it takes 18,000 euros a year to provide accommodation for a person who's seeking asylum. And there's 14,000 people who are still waiting for their first application to be processed. And, it's taking a year and a half for that process to happen on average. There's a person in the country 14 years waiting for their first application for asylum to be processed. 14 years. So at the same time then, the government has asylum seekers in tents in Chleirigh in the freezing cold, admits that there's about 300 asylum seekers now who are homeless, and says that it's the local authorities' job to provide emergency accommodation for homeless people, including homeless asylum seekers. And Meath County Council, for example, has no emergency accommodation beds in our county. So we have this ludicrous situation that the government will not differentiate between who needs help and who doesn't. and yet is just throwing people out in the streets, both Irish people and newcomers as well. And, you know, like, we put in questions to the government, how many asylum seekers are coming to the country who, you know, don't have any papers or who have false documents? And the government says, we don't know. Again, an incredible situation. We know that 60% of people coming through Dublin airport don't have documents or have false documents. But we don't know from any other airport or any other ferry terminal. And the danger about all of that is, if the government doesn't get this right, it could lead to people getting frustrated and angry. If the government doesn't consult with people on the ground, people feel that they have no control, no power anymore in their communities. If the government doesn't give a community dividend to constituencies that or communities that are taking in big numbers, well then this working class areas especially feel they're in competition for housing and for health and for transport and all the other issues. And if the government keeps using hotels in towns like Kilkenny and Killarney to house people who are coming into the country, many people in those towns feel that they don't have an ability to earn a living. And then again, and this is probably an issue we didn't touch on, there's a big incompetency issue at the heart of this government. So at the start of April last year, the government identified 500 buildings they felt were suitable for asylum seekers. By November, Roger O'Gorman went on prime time and said that 10 of those were in use. I put in a parliamentary question in January, and the government said 31 buildings have been bought to house asylum seekers. I asked how many were in use. 1 were in use. So 85% of the people who had offered a bedroom in their home for asylum seekers were never activated up until the end of last September. So even getting the simple stuff right, the government has been hopeless at doing it. And that's a big question that people need to start asking. Why is there such an incompetency issue at the heart of this government?
And also, next election.
And also on the whole subject of migration direct provision, there are companies out there who make significant sums of money off situation where you have someone 14 years waiting on an application, they're just in limbo, you know. So, you know, it's also it's become a very lucrative business as well.
And it's not fair on the asylum seeker either. You know what I mean? You know, the idea that somebody's life would be in limbo for that period of time is just, you know, bonkers. So, like, again, I suppose at the heart of our objective here is compassion and common sense. And again, no other political party. Like, I remember Fine Gaelers, you know, I got attacked by Fine Gaeler for even differentiating between there being different types of migrants into the state. And my retort was, we actually have an asylum process whose job it is to differentiate. You know, the idea that, and again, you know, people feeling that they don't have the right to speak. You do, as long as it's based on facts, as long as it's based on respect, you know, people should have the right to speak.
Yeah, and everybody's allowed to have, really, it's about really freedom of speech, common sense, respect, valuing and appreciating other people's point of views.
Yes.
And knowing, you know, if we listen, we can only fix things if we're willing to listen to other people's opinions.
Yeah, and name calling is a disaster from either side. You know, calling each other's you know, names, and we do see some people on the edges of both sides of the spectrum, and all they do is simply call names. And actually, do you know what? I think they need each other. I think that they need the bogeyman of the other side at the end of the spectrums. I think most people are genuinely in the middle, but I think most people in Ireland are not being represented by the establishment political parties for these issues. There's a chasm. There's an enormous gap between most people and where the political establishment exists.
Wow.
Well, we're running out of time. Paul, do you have any more questions?
No. We've covered a lot of subjects there. We've gone very broad spectrum indeed. So I suppose, Peadar, the last word, I think we've touched on it. The Irish politics at the moment, political class at the moment, is it would you say the whole lack of, say, common sense, and it's been, driven in a particular direction? Do you think that's the biggest issue right here, right now?
Yeah, I think at the heart of all of this is groupthink. At the heart of all of this is a fear, a lack of backbone, a lack of conviction in politics. You have a career. Most politicians in the Dála are career politicians. They'll do whatever it takes to keep their seat. The most important tool that they use politically is to stick their finger in the air, find out whatever way the wind's blowing, and they go in that direction. And that is the absolute wrong way to deliver political leadership. Aontú is about a political party that has core values, that stands up for those core values. A party based on evidence and science, and making sure that we have our feet and our roots in the communities that we serve, and we're not going to be fearful of speaking up on behalf of people, but we are only as strong as the people who join us. So I really encourage people to get involved.
And I suppose going forward, to actually heal the wrongs of the past, the next governments have to make right the wrongs of the past on the people that have been hurt since the foundation of the state.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that's the instincts of the government are to cover up, and we saw recently there where we saw that the state had literally done thousands of residents of nursing homes out of money that they were entitled to around these are medical card holders, and the instinct of the state and the Attorney General came out was to fight the citizen tooth and nail, right up to the steps of the court, right up until the week that they die, if necessary. And I think we need a society that stands up for the citizen and makes sure that those who have been wronged, that is recognized first and foremost, and those people have redress in terms of the losses that they have suffered.
Well, Peadar Tóibín, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to Paul and myself on the Irish Political Roundup.
Much obliged, Peadar, and